The Black Death, also called the Great Plague, was not a spell or a single bad cloud. It was an infectious disease caused by a bacterium named Yersinia pestis, and it can strike the human body in different ways. The best-known form is bubonic plague, where lymph nodes swell into painful lumps called buboes, and severe cases can spread into the blood or reach the lungs. When it reaches the lungs, pneumonic plague can pass between people through close contact and breath, which helps explain why fear moved fast, even when people tried to separate. To understand why it spread so violently in Europe, start with connection. 14th century Eurasia was tied together by trade routes moving silk, spices, grain, metals, and people. Outbreaks in parts of Central Asia and along steppe routes could travel toward the Black Sea, and ports in Crimea became key gateways into Mediterranean shipping lanes. One famous flashpoint was the port of Kaffa, where conflict, commerce, and crowded conditions created a perfect handoff point from land routes to ships. Ships were the plague's accelerators because ships carried food stores, cloth, ropes, barrels, and grain, and those supplies could also carry rodents and fleas. In many scenarios, the chain looks like this. Plague circulates among rodents, fleas feed on infected animals, then fleas bite humans when their usual hosts die or disappear. Europe's busiest ports were packed with warehouses and workers, so an infected vessel could seed a city, and a city could seed a whole region. Outbreaks are recorded in 1347 in Mediterranean ports like Messina, and the shock spread to places like Genoa, Venice, and Marseille as ships kept moving. Modern research adds a nuance here. Rats and fleas mattered, but human parasites and direct pneumonic spread may also have played roles, depending on place and season. That means the plague was not a single pathway, it was a cluster of pathways, and that flexibility made it harder to predict and stop. In other words, the same disease could arrive by ship, by traveler, or by household contact, and each route demanded a different defense. Then the highways kept going. Sailors moved port to port, merchants moved dock to market, and carts carried goods inland along rivers and roads. Even villages far from the sea were connected by fairs, pilgrim routes, and local trade, and every link in that chain was another chance for infection to jump. So the plague did not need to invade every place with an army, it only needed movement, and medieval Europe moved more than we imagine. Europe also had conditions that acted like dry tinder. Many towns were crowded, housing was tight, streets were narrow, and waste systems were limited. On top of that, the early 1300s brought climate stress and food crisis, including the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317, which weakened bodies before plague arrived. When a population is malnourished or exhausted, infections spread faster and kill more easily, so disease met a society already worn down. Now picture how people were affected. A healthy person could become sick quickly, fever, weakness, and then swelling in the groin, armpit, or neck. Families lost caregivers, farms lost laborers, and workshops lost skilled hands. Daily life broke apart because too many were gone at once. In many places, authorities struggled to keep services running, and that breakdown amplified panic because uncertainty is fuel for fear. Without germ theory, people searched for explanations. Many believed in miasma or bad air, others saw divine punishment, and some blamed planets and astrology. Tragically, Jewish communities were falsely accused of poisoning wells in parts of Europe, leading to persecutions, expulsions, and mass violence. At the same time, many communities tried practical measures they thought might help, burning herbs, limiting travel, and avoiding crowds when possible. Medical responses were limited but not absent. Physicians used the best frameworks they had, including humoral theory, diet advice, and attempts to rebalance the body. The famous beaked plague doctor image is later and often exaggerated, but protective clothing and scented materials reflect a real logic of the time, blocking corruption in the air. Even when treatments failed, People kept experimenting because during disaster, trying something can feel like the only way to stay human. How deadly was it? Estimates vary, but many historians describe Europe losing roughly a third of its population between 1347 and 1351, with some regions suffering far higher. Some chronicles describe towns where streets went quiet in days, and in certain communities the losses may have approached half. That demographic shock created a labor shortage. Fields were left untilled, wages rose in many places, and survivors could demand better terms because their work was scarce. Elites tried to freeze the old order. In England, the Ordinance of Labourers in 1349 and the Statute of Labourers in 1351 aimed to cap wages and restrict movement. Those pressures did not vanish. They built tension across decades. And in England, the Peasants' Revolt of 1381 became one dramatic eruption of anger and bargaining. Plague did not cause revolt by itself, but it shifted power, because when land is plentiful and labor is rare, the worker's position changes. Across Europe, old arrangements were renegotiated, sometimes peacefully, sometimes violently, and always under the memory of loss. Governments learned new habits, especially in port cities forced to face repeated waves of disease, not once, but again and again. Italian city-states developed quarantine practices, the idea of holding ships and travelers for a set period linked to 40 days, 40 giorni, and they formed health boards. One early example often cited is Ragusa in 1377, requiring arriving travelers to wait before entering. These systems were imperfect and sometimes harsh, but they were early steps toward organized public health based on observation, record-keeping, and coordinated action. Cities also experimented with barriers, closing gates, isolating houses, restricting markets, and sometimes creating cordons to slow movement between regions. Even when these measures failed, they left a blueprint that the state could manage risk with rules, enforcement, and information, not only with prayer or punishment. Over time, that idea contributed to stronger administrations, because crisis pushes governments to build tools they did not need in calmer years. Culture changed too, because mass death forces questions that normal life can postpone. Art and literature absorbed the mood. The dance of death motif reminded people that status could not bargain with mortality, and writers like Boccaccio used plague settings to reveal character. Religious life shifted in multiple directions. Some people sought deeper faith, others questioned institutions, and reform movements gained energy in a shaken world. Economically, the short term was disruption. Trade slowed, shortages hit, and some towns declined. But the long term often brought higher wages for many survivors. Marginal land was abandoned, and resources were spread among fewer people, which could raise living standards in some regions, even as grief and fear remained. This was not a good outcome. It was a painful rebalancing after catastrophe, and it reshaped Europe's trajectory. And the plague did not simply end in 1351. It returned in later outbreaks for centuries, including major waves like the Great Plague of London in 1665. That long shadow influenced city planning and sanitation efforts because repeated crises pushed societies to improve water, waste control, and crowd management. It also preserved memory, so people watched for signs, tracked rumors, and lived with the knowledge that the invisible enemy could come back. If you zoom out, the Black Death is also a lesson in networks. The same connections that enrich a society can also carry risk at the speed of travel. When trade moves fast, pathogens can move faster unless communities coordinate information, limit exposure, and build trust instead of blame. That is why scapegoating is not only immoral, it is strategically dangerous because it wastes time while the disease spreads. So why did the Black Death spread? Biology met infrastructure, a bacterium moving through flea bites, and sometimes through breath, carried by ships, markets, and roads. Crowded cities, weak sanitation, and prior hunger created vulnerability, while fear and misinformation shaped reactions, sometimes toward care, sometimes toward violence. And what were the outcomes? A transformed population, a rebalanced economy, early public health systems, cultural upheaval, and a Europe that never returned to the old balance, only moved forward into a different world for generations ahead and beyond.